To create a gradient area chart with a toggle that switches between two metrics, where both the chart's gradient color and the line color change based on the selected metric, we'll create three calculated fields. So I'll create a calculated field, and this first one will be for our normalized metric. And for this, I'm going to start with one metric, price. So I'll type the sum of our price minus the window minimum of the sum of the price. And that's going to be in parentheses, and I'll divide that by the window max of the sum of the price. And then I'll subtract the window minimum of the sum of the price. This formula calculates how much each price compares to the lowest and highest prices within the dataset. And it transforms these prices into a scale of 0 to 1, where 0 is the lowest price in the group and 1 is the highest price in the group. And I'm going to copy this formula because it's going to have the same structure as our normalized date. So I'll create another calculated field called norm date, and I'll paste our norm metric formula in here. And everywhere where there's a sum, I'm going to change it to the minimum. And everywhere there's a price, I'm going to change it to our date field. So this calculated field is doing the same thing as our last one, except for this time we're comparing each date to the highest and lowest date within our dataset. And lastly, to ensure that our gradients doesn't go above the path that we set, I'm going to create another calculated field for the reversed metric. And this one will just be 1 minus our normalized metric. So it'll be like a normal area chart, but just flipped upside down. To create the structure, I'm going to pull our normalized date into the columns, and I'll pull our normalized metric into the rows, and our reverse metric into the rows. And then under the all marks, I'll move our date field. And I don't want this to be in years, so I'm going to right click and choose the day. And then I'll right click again to make it discrete. The reason I added this field in here is because we're going to have our formulas compute using that date. So I'll right click on our norm date field, go to compute using, and choose date. And I'll do the same process for norm metric and the reversed metric. So you can see how the bottom chart, which is our reverse metric, is just the flipped version of our normalized metric. To get this on the same axis, I'm going to right click on our reverse metric field and choose dual axis. So you can easily see here how the reverse one just flips it upside down. But we don't need the coloring, so I'm going to remove measure names from the all marks. And under the first mark, I'm going to change it from a shape to a line. And under the second mark, I'll change it to an area. For the color, I want to set it to white at 100%. And on our left axis, I'm going to right click and edit the axis. I'll give this a custom range between -0.05 and 1.05. Then I'll right click and move marks to the front. That way our line chart appears in front of our area. I'll also edit our right axis and give it that same custom range between -0.05 and 1.05. Then under the scale, I'm going to check off the reversed. So now our area chart that has a white background is everything above the line. This will contain our gradients to everything below the line. To add the gradients, I'm going to go to the Map tab at the top, choose Background Images, and choose our stock data source. And I'll add an image that I created from Canva, which is just a gradients. For the normalized date, I'm going to set it from 0 to 1. And for the Y field, I'm going to choose our normalized metric and also set it from 0 to 1. Then under Options, I like to uncheck locking the aspect ratio. And now that we have our gradients, you can see there's a little bit of white part between our line and our area chart. So I'll go to our first mark, and for the color, I'm going to choose the same color as the top of our gradients. And to get rid of that little white part, I'm going to remove the halo effect. For formatting, I'm going to remove all 3 headers. And then I'll format the worksheet, and I'll remove the row divider and the column divider. And under the lines, I'm going to remove the 0 lines for the sheet, so we're left with just the gradient area chart. On a dashboard, I'm going to drag the gradient area chart worksheet on, hide the title, and resize it. Right now, we can see the overall trend, but without the axes showing dates and values, it's hard to tell exactly when things happened or how big the changes were. So to add the date axis, I'm going to create a new worksheet called Axis. And for this, I just need to pull our date field into the columns, and then I'll right-click and make it a day. That way it matches our gradient area chart. Then I'll change it from automatic to a polygon. And we know what these dates represent, so I'm going to right-click, edit the axis, and I'll get rid of the title. Then on our dashboard, I'm going to add our Axis worksheet. I'll hide the title, and I'm going to resize it so it's underneath our gradient area chart. And I'll also set this up to fill the entire view. The gradient area chart ends pretty abruptly on both sides. So instead of having the width of the worksheet match the width of the white container, I'm going to pull it a bit further out so that the end of the gradient area chart is aligned with the end of the white container. And you can see right now there's a bit of white on the outside, so I'm going to right-click Format, go to Shading, and change the shading to be None. And now I can pull it out so that the end of our area chart matches the end of our white container. And now that I have that aligned where I want it, I'm going to right-click Format on our dates, and I'll make it a little bit darker and increase the size. But because we're using normalized fields to create this gradient area chart, the tooltip doesn't give us a good idea of what the values are. So I'll go back to our area chart worksheet, and under the second mark, I'm going to go to the tooltip and remove everything in there for area. And for the line, we can see that day is already in there, so I'm going to add in our price field. Now we can edit the tooltip, and I'm going to remove everything in there that isn't the date field or the price field. And I'll format the date field to be a little bit larger. And I'll just add a $sign in front of the price so it's clear what that value represents. And now when I hover over one of the points in our line, it's clear what the price is on that day. But if I were to add all the values onto the chart, it'd become extremely cluttered. So instead, I'm going to add the maximum and minimum points so we can better estimate where any other point falls by seeing how close it is to these extremes. And this will give us a clear sense of how all the other values are spread out. To add the max and minimum, I'm going to go back to our area chart worksheet, and under the first mark, I'm going to change the sum of our price to a text. And you can see how this quickly clutters our dashboard. So I'll go to the label and the marks, and I'll choose min max to display only the minimum and maximum values. This chart does a great job of showing the trend of the stock price over time. But to make it even better, we could add another metric like volume for the same time period, so we can switch between stock price and volume. And we'll add conditional coloring to the metrics. To create this conditional area chart, we'll need to edit our normalized metric field. But that calculation can only be computed using one field's values. And right now our price and volume are separate fields. To make them one field, I'll go back to our data source. And I'll select our volume and price fields, and then right-click and pivot. This is a workaround I like to use for being able to use measure values and measure names within calculated fields. So now you can see we have one field that has all the values for volume and price. Now if we go back to the area chart, you can see we have some fields that are red because price is no longer a field. So I'm going to edit our normalized metric field, and instead of price, I'll use the pivot field values. And I'll just go through and replace all those. And there's still one red field, that's why we can't see the chart yet. So I'm going to go to the first mark, and instead of the sum of the price, I'll pull in the pivot field values. But since we're using the pivot values, which contains both the volume and the price, we're seeing both of those in the chart. To see only one at a time, I'm going to pull the pivot field name into the filters. And I'll start off with checking off just price. Then I'll right-click to show the filter on the worksheet. And now we can filter to choose which metric we want to see on the chart. But it'd be even more helpful if the gradient color changed based on which metric is selected. So when price is selected, we'll see a blue gradients, and when volume is selected, we'll see a green gradients. To do this, I'll need to pull our pivot field names into the columns next to norm date. And I don't want the label, so I'm going to hide the label and hide the header. Then I'll go to the Map tab at the top and choose Background Images and select our stock data source. I'll click on the current background image that we're using and hit Edit. And then under the Options tab, I'll add a condition. I'll select the field Pivot Names and choose Price. So the chart will only show the background image with the blue gradients when price is what's selected. For volume, I'll need to add another image, and I'll choose a green gradient background. And we'll set this up the same as we have the other one, where the norm date is between 0 and 1, and the norm metric is between 0 and 1. Under the Options tab, I'll uncheck locking the aspect ratio, and then I'll add a condition and say when the pivot field name is volume. So now we can use this filter on the right to toggle between the price and the volume. But you can see the line itself is blue no matter what, and I want that to match the top of the gradients, whether it's green or blue. So to make that line conditional, I'll add our pivot field names into the first mark, and I'll change that to a color. Then I'll edit the legend for that color, and since we're doing green for volume, I'm going to choose a green. I created these custom color palettes already, but I have another video for how to do that. Then I'll switch it from volume to price, and I'll edit the legend for the color for price and choose a blue. So now we've assigned a color for our gradient area chart and our line for each metric. To allow users to be able to filter, we can go back to our dashboard, and I'll click on the chart and do the down arrow, go to Filters, and choose the pivot field names. Then you can go to the down arrow on the filter and choose one of the single value options. So users are able to toggle between our metrics, price, and volume. And you can do even more metrics than just these two. And while a single drop-down filter is effective, a more intuitive way to allow users to switch between volume and price is with the toggle switch. And using a toggle switch, we can make the color of the toggle switch and the labels responsive to the metrics. So the metric that's selected will match the color of the area chart. So on a new worksheet, I'm going to create a parameter. I'll call this the toggle param and set the data type to a string. For the current value, I want to leave this empty. Then I'll right-click to show the parameter on the worksheet. For the toggle switch, we need two calculated fields. So I'm going to create a calculated field called toggle-select. In here, I'll say if the toggle parameter is equal to the pivot field names, then true, else false. So this formula will return true when it's selected and false when it's not. I'll create another calculated field and call this toggle-name for param. In here, I'll type if the toggle parameter equals price, then return volume, else return the price. So if the parameter is set to price, the output will be volume. And if the parameter is set to anything other than price, the output will be price. To build the structure of the toggle, I just need to drag the toggle name for param field into the marks. And I'm going to change this from automatic to a shape. And I want our name for param field to determine the shape. So going back to the dashboard, I'll add our toggle switch worksheet. I'll hide the title and set it to the entire view. Because we're using the value in our parameter to determine what's shown in the graph, we can go to the dashboard tab at the top, hit actions, and add a parameter action. This will allow us to add the switch functionality for our toggle. For the source sheet, I just want to have the toggle switch worksheet checked off. I want to target the toggle param using the toggle name for param as the source field. And now when I click on our switch, you can see it changes between a circle and a square based on whether volume or price is selected. But I don't think a circle or a square is a good visual representation of what is being selected. So I'll edit the shape for our legend, and I'll choose this filter images shape palette that I loaded in here. But I have another video for how to load custom shapes. So whatever's in our parameter, which in this case is volume, is going to be the opposite of what's shown on our graph. So it might seem counterintuitive, but for volume, I'm going to add the toggle I want when price is selected. And since price is blue in our graph, I'm going to add the blue toggle. Then I'll click on our toggle button to switch it. And then I'll edit the shapes for the legend. And since this is going to represent when volume is selected, I'm going to choose a green toggle. So now I have the functionality to switch the toggle between price and volume, but I haven't linked anything to our chart yet. So I'll go back to our area chart worksheet, and I'll remove the filter for the pivot field names. And instead I'll drag the toggle select field into the filters and set it to only true. So now when I use the toggle to switch between volume and price, the chart updates with that metric. And the toggle's looking super small right now, so I'm going to go back to our toggle switch worksheet, and I'll use the size slider in the marks to increase the size. To avoid confusion, I'm going to go to the tooltip and remove everything that's in there. This is because the field that's in there is actually the opposite of what's being represented in our chart. One option for labels is to add the text price on the left of the toggle and volume on the right. But to make it even more clear to users which is selected, I want the label to be responsive. So when a metric is not selected, I want it to have a black label. And when a metric is selected, I want the color of the label to match the color of the toggle and the area chart. So on a new worksheet, I'll start by adding pivot field names to the columns. And I'll add that same field to the marks twice. I want one to be a label and the other to be a color. To make the color also responsive to whether it's selected or not, I'll add our toggle select field into the marks and change it to a color. Then I'll edit the colors for the legend, and for a false, I want to choose black. And when volume is true, I want it to be green. Then on a dashboard, I want to add our switch labels worksheet. And I'm going to click the toggle so that it switches. And then I'll edit the color of the legends, and for false, I want to do black again. For true, I'll do blue so that it matches our area chart and our toggle for price. And now when I click on the toggle to switch between price and volume, the color of the label is responsive to both the metric and whether or not it's selected. For formatting, I'll hide the title, and then I'll right-click and uncheck Show Header. Then I'll format the worksheet, and I'm going to make the font a little bit bigger and a little bit darker. And under alignment, I'm going to go to the horizontal alignment and choose center. For shading, I'm going to change the worksheet shading to none. And under the borders, I'm going to remove the row divider. Then I'll set our label worksheet to the entire view. And I'll resize it so that the toggle's in between the labels. To get the toggle in front of the labels, I'll go to the Layout tab, and I'll move the toggle switch ahead of the labels. Then I'll right-click Format on our toggle, go to Shading, and change it to be None. Now instead of using Tableau's default filter to switch between price and volume, we have a more intuitive way to filter. And since the color of the toggle and label are responsive to the selected metric, it's immediately obvious to users which metric they're viewing. So it also doubles as a built-in legend.